Car salesman humiliates and throws out elderly customer without knowing he is the new owner of the place, instantly regrets it, and something beautiful happened. The elegant luxury car dealership gleamed under the soft glow of recessed lighting, its polished floors reflecting the sleek curves of the latest high-end vehicles. The air was thick with the scent of leather and new car interiors, a sensory reminder of wealth and status. It was into this pristine environment that George Hartley stepped, his weathered shoes squeaking slightly on the immaculate floor. 72. George's face was a roadmap of a life well lived, etched with lines that spoke of both joy and hardship. His silver hair, neatly combed but slightly tousled by the brisk wind outside, contrasted sharply with the slick, styled coiffures of the young salespeople who populated the showroom floor. His coat, once a proud statement piece but now showing its age, hung loosely on his frame, a far cry from the tailored suits that adorned the staff. As George's eyes adjusted to the bright interior, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement. This was his first visit to the dealership since acquiring it, a fact known only to a select few at the corporate level. He had decided to make this initial visit incognito, driven by a desire to understand the true nature of the business he had invested in. The reaction to his presence was immediate and visceral. Heads turned, eyebrows raised, and whispers began to circulate like a soft breeze through the showroom. George caught snippets of conversation, words like lost and mistake reaching his ears. He felt a familiar ache in his chest, one he had hoped to have left behind in his younger years, the pain of being judged solely on appearance. A young salesman, his badge identifying him as Frank, detached himself from a group near a sleek sports car and approached George. His walk was confident, almost swaggering, and his expression was a mask of barely concealed disdain. "Can I help you, sir?" Frank's voice was loud, deliberately so, ensuring that his colleagues could hear every word. "Are you sure you're in the right place? The used car lot is just down the street." George felt his face flush, a mix of embarrassment and indignation rising within him. He opened his mouth to respond, but Frank continued, his tone growing more condescending with each word. "You see, we deal in luxury vehicles here. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable somewhere, more suited to your situation." The laughter that followed was like a physical blow to George. He looked around, seeing the smirking faces of the other employees, their eyes filled with mockery and contempt. In that moment, George felt every one of his 72 years, the weight of their judgment pressing down on him like a tangible force. As he stood there, surrounded by gleaming machines worth more than most people's annual salaries, George was struck by the irony of his situation. He, the owner of this very dealership, was being treated as if he were nothing more than a nuisance, an unwelcome intruder in a world of luxury and privilege. With a deep breath, George squared his shoulders. He may have come here to observe, but now he realized he had stumbled upon something far more significant, a chance to challenge perceptions and make a real difference. As Frank continued his tirade, George's mind was already racing, formulating a plan that would shake the very foundations of this dealership and the people within it. Little did Frank and his colleagues know, but their world was about to be turned upside down by the very man they were so quick to dismiss. The tension in the air was palpable as George stood his ground, facing Frank's increasingly hostile demeanor. Around them, other employees had begun to gather, drawn by the spectacle of the confrontation. Their faces were a mix of amusement and discomfort, some reveling in Frank's public humiliation of the old man, others shifting uneasily, sensing that something wasn't quite right about the situation. Among the onlookers was Sarah Chen, a newly hired sales associate in her mid-20s. Unlike her colleagues, Sarah felt a growing sense of unease as she watched the scene unfold. There was something in the old man's bearing, a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with Frank's assumptions. She found herself taking a step forward, her instinct to intervene warring with her desire to fit in with her new co-workers. Frank, emboldened by the attention of his peers, continued his verbal assault. "Listen, old-timer," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm trying to do you a favor here. This isn't a place for window shopping or reliving your glory days. These cars, they're for people who can actually afford them." George's hands trembled slightly, but whether from anger or hurt, it was hard to tell. His voice, when he spoke, was soft but clear. "Young man, I assure you I am perfectly capable of—" "Capable?" Frank interrupted with a harsh laugh. "Capable of what? Remembering where you parked your mobility scooter." This elicited a few chuckles from the crowd, but Sarah noticed that some of her colleagues were beginning to look uncomfortable. George took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room. He saw the judging looks, the smirks, the rolled eyes. But he also saw Sarah, her face a mixture of concern and indecision. In that moment he made a decision. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly, dismissed because of their age or appearance. "I came here today," George began, his voice gaining strength, "to look at the cars available. Is that not allowed?" Frank snorted, crossing his arms. "Look, Grandpa, why don't you tell us what you're really doing here? Did you get lost on your way to the bingo hall? Or maybe you're collecting for some charity?" His tone made it clear that he found either option equally implausible. George felt a flash of anger, quickly suppressed. He had faced prejudice before, but never so blatantly, never with such cruel intent. He thought of all the people his age, who might walk into this dealership, people with dreams and the means to fulfill them, only to be treated with this level of disrespect. Sarah, unable to contain herself any longer, stepped forward. "Frank, maybe we should—" "Stay out of this." "Newbie," Frank snapped, not even bothering to look at her. "I've got this under control." George's eyes met Sarah's for a brief moment, and he saw in them a glimmer of the change he hoped to inspire. But before he could say anything, Frank was speaking again, his voice rising. "I think it's time for you to leave, old man, before things get any more embarrassing for you." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. George looked around one last time, taking in the faces of those who would judge a person solely on their appearance. Then, with a small nod, he turned and walked slowly towards the exit. As the door closed behind him, the showroom erupted into a buzz of conversation. Frank, basking in what he perceived as a victory, turned to his colleagues with a triumphant grin. "And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you handle time-wasters." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened, something that would have repercussions far beyond this single interaction. As she watched her co-workers laugh and pat Frank on the back, she made a silent promise, to herself, that she would not let this incident pass without action. Outside, George stood on the sidewalk, the cool air a stark contrast to the heated atmosphere he had just left. He pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the keypad. For a moment he considered walking away, letting this experience fade into memory. But then he thought of Sarah, of the flicker of decency he had seen in her eyes. He thought of all the other George out there, facing discrimination and disrespect every day. With renewed determination, he dialed a number. As it rang, he looked back at the dealership, its gleaming facade hiding the ugliness he had just witnessed. Things were about to change, and George Hartley was going to be the catalyst. The following morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within the walls of the luxury car dealership. The staff arrived as usual, trading gossip about the previous day's events, most still finding amusement in Frank's handling of the old man's situation. But there was an undercurrent of unease, a sense that something was off. Sarah Chen arrived early, her mind still troubled by what she had witnessed. As she organized her desk, she couldn't shake the image of George's dignified face in the face of such blatant disrespect. She had tossed and turned all night, torn between her desire to fit in with her new colleagues and her innate sense of right and wrong. Just as the staff was settling into their morning routines, the main doors burst open. Henry Blackwell, the regional director, strode in, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Behind him walked George Hartley, his demeanor calm but purposeful. The reaction was immediate. Conversations died mid-sentence, replaced by a stunned silence. Frank, who had been regaling a group with an exaggerated retelling of yesterday's events, froze, his cocky smile fading as he took in the scene before him. Henry's voice, when he spoke, cut through the silence like a knife. "Everyone in the conference room, now!" As the staff filed in, confusion and apprehension evident on their faces, Sarah caught George's eye. He gave her a small nod, a gesture that somehow both reassured and unsettled her. Once everyone was seated, Henry took center stage, his gaze sweeping the room. "I hope you're all proud of yourselves," he began, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Yesterday, this dealership hit a new low in customer service and basic human decency." Frank, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, attempted to interject. "Sir, if this is about that old man yesterday, I can explain—" "Shut it, Frank," Henry snapped. "You've done enough talking." He turned to George, his demeanor softening. "Mr. Hartley, I believe you have something to say to the team." A collective gasp went through the room as the implications of Henry's words sank in. George stepped forward, his presence commanding despite his unassuming appearance. "For those who don't know me, I'm George Hartley, the new owner of this dealership," he began, his voice steady and clear. "Yesterday I came here incognito, hoping to understand how this business treats its customers. What I experienced was nothing short of shameful." He recounted the events of the previous day, not sparing any details. As he spoke, Sarah saw the color drain from Frank's face, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I was judged, mocked, and dismissed based solely on my appearance and age," George continued. "This behavior is not only morally reprehensible, but goes against everything this company should stand for." He paused, letting his words sink in. "From this moment on, things are going to change around here. We will implement comprehensive training programs, focusing on empathy, respect for all individuals regardless of age or appearance, and inclusive customer service." The room was dead silent, the weight of George's words hanging heavy in the air. Sarah felt a mix of emotions: relief that action was being taken, admiration for George's handling of the situation, and a twinge of guilt for not having done more yesterday. George's gaze fell on Frank, who looked as if he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. "As for you, young man," George said, his tone firm but not unkind, "you have a choice to make. You can either be part of the positive change we're going to make here, or you can find employment elsewhere. The decision is yours." Frank, his arrogance completely deflated, struggled to find words. "Mr. Hartley, I'm sorry, I had no idea. What I did was inexcusable." George nodded, acknowledging the apology. "Actions speak louder than words, Frank. I believe in second chances, but I also believe in accountability. You'll have the opportunity to prove yourself, but know that I'll be watching closely." As the meeting concluded and the shell-shocked staff filed out, Sarah lingered behind. She approached George, her heart pounding. "Mr. Hartley," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I want to apologize. I should have done more yesterday." George turned to her, his eyes kind. "Sarah, isn't it?" She nodded. "You were the only one who showed any inclination to intervene. That counts for something. But you're right, you could have done more. We all can always do more." He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I have a feeling you're going to be an important part of the changes we're making here. Are you up for the challenge?" Sarah straightened, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced before. "Yes, sir, I am." As they walked out of the conference room together, Sarah couldn't help but feel that this was more than just a change in company policy. It was the beginning of a journey that would challenge not just the dealership, but each individual within, feared to become better versions of themselves. The ripples of change had begun, and only time would tell how far they would spread. In the days following George's revelation, the atmosphere at the dealership was charged with a mix of tension and uncertainty. The staff, accustomed to their old ways of doing business, found themselves grappling with the sudden shift in expectations and values. Frank, once the swaggering king of the sales floor, now moved through the showroom like a shadow of his former self. The weight of his actions and the public dressing down he had received seemed to have deflated him entirely. His colleagues, who had once laughed along with his jokes and antics, now gave him a wide berth, as if his fall from grace might be contagious. Sarah, on the other hand, found herself thrust into an unexpected role. George had taken a particular interest in her potential, often seeking her input on the changes being implemented. This newfound attention, while flattering, also made her a target for resentment among some of her co-workers. One afternoon, as Sarah was arranging brochures at her desk, she overheard a conversation between two of her colleagues, Tom and Rachel, who were huddled near the water cooler. "Can you believe this?" Tom grumbled, his voice low but clearly agitated. "Sensitivity training? Empathy workshops? What's next? Group hugs before every shift?" Rachel nodded in agreement. "I know, right? We're here to sell cars, not hold hands and sing Kumbaya. This new owner is going to run this place into the ground." Sarah felt her chest tighten at their words. She wanted to speak up, to defend the changes that she knew were necessary, but the fear of further alienating herself held her back. As she wrestled with her conscience, she didn't notice George approaching until he was right beside her. "Quite the challenge we have ahead of us, don't we?" he said softly, startling her. Sarah jumped slightly, then nodded. "Yes, Mr. Hartley. I was just—" George smiled, understanding. "You were just listening to your colleagues express their doubts about our new direction." It wasn't a question. Sarah's face flushed with embarrassment, but George continued, his voice gentle but firm. "Change is never easy, Sarah. People resist it, fear it, but that doesn't mean it's not necessary." He gestured towards Tom and Rachel, who had now moved. On to complaining about the new customer feedback system. They're scared. They've built their careers on a certain way of doing things, and now we're asking them to relearn everything they thought they knew. Sarah nodded, understanding dawning. "So, what do we do? How do we get them on board?" George's eyes twinkled, with a mix of wisdom and mischief. "We show them. We lead by example. And sometimes we need to let them experience the change for themselves." Over the next few weeks, George implemented a series of changes that went beyond mere policy updates. He instituted a role reversal day, where the sales staff had to pose as customers from various walks of life, elderly, disabled, from different cultural backgrounds. The exercise was met with initial eye-rolling and sarcasm, but as the day progressed, Sarah noticed a shift in her colleagues' demeanor. Tom, who had been so vocal in his complaints, found himself struggling to navigate the showroom in a wheelchair, frustration evident on his face as he realized how inaccessible certain areas were. Rachel, playing the role of an elderly customer, experienced firsthand the dismissive attitudes she had so often displayed herself. At the end of the day, George gathered everyone for a debrief. The room was quiet, the usual bravado and chatter notably absent. "So," George began, his voice calm and measured, "what did we learn today?" For a moment, no one spoke. Then, to everyone's surprise, Frank stood up. His face was a mixture of shame and determination. "We learned that we've been doing it wrong," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "All this time, we've been judging people, making assumptions. I never realized how bad the situation was." Frank's voice trailed off, heavy with realization. The room remained silent, each person lost in their own thoughts about the day's experiences. George nodded, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and compassion. "It's not easy to confront our own biases, is it? But that's exactly what we need to do if we want to truly serve our customers, all of our customers." Sarah watched as her colleagues' faces registered a range of emotions: shame, understanding, and for some the first glimmers of acceptance. She felt a surge of hope, sensing that maybe, just maybe, real change was possible. As the meeting concluded, George approached Sarah. "Well done today," he said quietly. "Your empathy and willingness to embrace these changes are setting an example for others." Sarah felt a flush of pride at his words, but also a twinge of uncertainty. "Thank you, Mr. Hartley. But I can't help wondering, will it be enough? Can we really change the culture here?" George's eyes crinkled with a gentle smile. "Change doesn't happen overnight, Sarah. It's a process, often a slow and challenging one. But every small step, every mind we open, brings us closer to where we need to be." As they walked out of the conference room, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much longer journey, one that would test not just the dealership, but each person within it, in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The weeks following the role reversal exercise saw a gradual shift in the dealership's atmosphere. While resistance to change still simmered beneath the surface, there was an undeniable difference in how the staff interacted with each other and with customers. Frank in particular had undergone a remarkable transformation. Gone was the arrogant swagger, replaced by a quieter, more thoughtful demeanor. He threw himself into the new training programs with a fervor that surprised everyone, especially Sarah. One afternoon, as Sarah was helping an elderly couple browse through the latest models, she noticed Frank approaching. Her body tensed instinctively, memories of his past behavior flashing through her mind. But to her surprise, Frank's manner was respectful and attentive. "Excuse me," he said politely to the couple. "I couldn't help but overhear that you're interested in a vehicle with easy access. Would you mind if I showed you a model that I think might suit your needs perfectly?" Sarah watched in amazement as Frank guided the couple through the showroom, patiently explaining features and even demonstrating how easily the seats could be adjusted for comfort. When the couple left with smiles on their faces and a promise to return, Sarah couldn't contain her curiosity any longer. "Frank," she called out as he was walking back to his desk, "that was impressive. What changed?" Frank paused, a mix of emotions playing across his face. "You know, Sarah, I've been asking myself the same question." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I guess it took seeing myself through someone else's eyes to realize what a jerk I'd been." Sarah nodded encouragingly, sensing Frank struggled to articulate his thoughts. "When Mr. Hartley came in that day, disguised as just another old man, I treated him like he was nothing. Less than nothing." Frank's voice cracked slightly. "And then I realized that's how I've been treating people for years. Not just here, but everywhere." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. "It's not easy to admit that, Frank, but recognizing it is the first step to changing it." Frank nodded, a rueful smile on his face. "Yeah, well, I've got a long way to go. But I'm trying, and you know what? It feels good, really good." As Frank walked away, Sarah felt a surge of hope. If someone like Frank could change so dramatically, maybe there was hope for the entire dealership after all. The next day, George called Sarah into his office. As she entered, she was surprised to see Frank already seated there. "Sarah, Frank," George began, his tone serious but with an undercurrent of excitement. "I have a proposition for you both. I want you to lead our new customer experience initiative." Sarah and Frank exchanged shocked glances. George continued, "You've both shown remarkable growth and insight over the past few weeks. Frank, your transformation has been nothing short of inspiring. And Sarah, your unwavering commitment to our new values has set the standard for others to follow." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Together, I believe you can help us reshape not just how we do business, but how we connect with our customers on a human level." As Sarah left the office, her mind reeling from the new responsibility, she couldn't help but marvel at the strange turns life could take. Just weeks ago, she and Frank had been on opposite sides of a moral divide. Now they were allies in a mission to transform the very culture of the dealership. She realized that change, real change, often came from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, the most unlikely partnerships could lead to the most profound transformations. As Sarah and Frank dove into their new roles leading the Customer Experience Initiative, the effects began to ripple through the dealership in ways no one had anticipated. Their unlikely partnership, born from conflict and transformation, became a powerful symbol of the change George was trying to implement. Their first major project was to redesign the showroom layout. Gone were the intimidating rows of sleek vehicles that created a barrier between customers and staff. In their place, they created cozy seating areas interspersed among the cars, encouraging conversations rather than high-pressure sales tactics. "The idea," Sarah explained to a group of skeptical salespeople, "is to make customers feel welcome, regardless of their age, appearance, or budget. We want them to explore at their own pace, to feel comfortable asking questions." Frank chimed in, his newfound empathy shining through. "Remember, folks, we're not just selling cars. We're helping people find solutions to their transportation needs. That means listening more than talking." The change wasn't without its challenges. Some of the older salespeople, set in their ways, grumbled about the soft approach. Tom, in particular, was vocal in his opposition. "This is ridiculous," he complained loudly one afternoon. "We're turning into a social club instead of a business. How are we supposed to meet our quotas if we're busy holding hands and singing Kumbaya?" Sarah, overhearing this, felt a flash of frustration. She was about to respond when George appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. "Tom," George said, his voice calm but firm, "I understand your concerns, but I want you to consider something. What if our success wasn't measured solely by the number of cars we sell, but by the number of customers who leave here feeling respected and valued?" Tom scoffed. "With all due respect, Mr. Hartley, feelings don't pay the bills." George smiled, a twinkle in his eye. "No? Then explain to me why our customer satisfaction scores have gone up 30% in the last month, or why our repeat business has increased by 25%. Tom's mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. "You see," George continued, "when people feel valued, they come back. They tell their friends. And yes, Tom, they buy more cars, not because we pressured them, but because they trust us." As George walked away, Sarah caught Frank's eye across the room. They shared a small smile, both recognizing the significance of the moment. It wasn't just about changing policies or procedures, it was about shifting an entire mindset. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Frank worked tirelessly to implement their ideas. They organized community events, inviting local seniors and disability groups to special after-hours showings where they could explore the vehicles at their own pace. They instituted a mentorship program, pairing newer employees with experienced staff members to foster a culture of continuous learning and growth. One evening, as they were wrapping up a particularly successful event for a local veterans group, Frank turned to Sarah, his eyes shining with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "You know," he said, his voice soft, "a month ago I would have laughed at the idea of doing something like this. I would have said it was a waste of time." Sarah nodded, understanding. "And now?" Frank gestured to the room, where veterans of all ages were chatting animatedly with staff members, some seated comfortably in the cars, others gathered around the refreshment table. Now I see that this is what it's all about, connecting with people, making a difference." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. "It's pretty amazing, isn't it, how much can change in such a short time?" As they stood there, watching the scene before them, Sarah realized that the transformation happening in the dealership was more than just a business strategy. It was a reminder of the profound impact that compassion and understanding could have not just on a company's bottom line, but on the lives of everyone it touched. The ripple effect of their efforts was spreading, touching not just customers and employees, but extending into the community. And Sarah knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that this was only the beginning. Just as the dealership seemed to be hitting its stride with the new customer-centric approach, an unexpected challenge arose that would test the resolve of everyone involved. It came in the form of a scathing online review that quickly went viral. The review, posted by a customer named Michael Chen, detailed an experience that seemed to contradict everything the dealership had been working towards. Michael described feeling ignored and belittled during his visit, claiming that the staff had made assumptions about his ability to afford a luxury vehicle based on his age and appearance. The post spread like wildfire across social media platforms, drawing angry comments and calls for boycotts. Local news outlets picked up the story, running sensationalized headlines about age discrimination and poor customer service. George called an emergency meeting, his face grave as he addressed the assembled staff. "I won't sugarcoat this," he began, his voice heavy with concern. "This situation has the potential to undo all the progress we've made." Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. She had been so caught up in the positive changes they'd been making that she'd almost forgotten how fragile public perception could be. Frank, standing beside her, looked shell-shocked. "But we've been doing everything right," he protested. "How could this happen?" George held up a hand to quiet the murmurs rippling through the room. "That's what we need to figure out. I want a full investigation into Mr. Chen's visit, every detail, every interaction. We need to understand what went wrong and how we can make it right." As the meeting dispersed, Sarah and Frank huddled together, both feeling the weight of responsibility on their shoulders. "We should talk to Mr. Chen," Sarah suggested. "Hear his side of the story directly." Frank nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Agreed. And we need to review our security footage, see if we can piece together what happened." Over the next few days, Sarah and Frank threw themselves into the investigation. They pored over security tapes, interviewed staff members, and reached out to Michael Chen, who initially refused to speak with them. As they dug deeper, a complicated picture began to emerge. The security footage showed Michael entering the E dealership on a busy Saturday afternoon. He had wandered the showroom for nearly 20 minutes without being approached by any staff member. When someone finally did speak to him, it was a new hire who had missed several of the recent training sessions. The interaction was brief and, from what they could see, somewhat dismissive. "It's not as bad as the review made it sound," Frank said, re-watching the footage for the 10th time. "But it's not good either. We dropped the ball." Sarah nodded, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. "We've made so much progress, but this shows we still have a long way to go." Just as they were about to present their findings to George, Sarah's phone rang. It was Michael Chen agreeing to meet with them. The meeting, held in a quiet coffee shop away from the dealership, was tense at first. Michael, a soft-spoken man in his early 60s, seemed wary and defensive. But as Sarah and Frank listened to his story, acknowledging the dealership's failings and explaining the changes they'd been trying to implement, his demeanor began to soften. "I never wanted to cause such a fuss," Michael admitted, his hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee. "I was just so frustrated. I've dealt with this kind of treatment before, being ignored or dismissed because of how I look or my age. I guess this was just the last straw." Sarah leaned forward, her voice earnest. "Mr. Chen, we can't change what happened to you, but we want to learn from it. Would you be willing to work with us, to help us do better?" Michael looked surprised at the suggestion. "Work with you? How?" Frank jumped in, his eyes alight with an idea. "We've been implementing new training programs, trying to change the culture of our dealership. But hearing from someone who's experienced discrimination firsthand, that could be incredibly powerful." As they continued to talk, outlining ideas for sensitivity workshops and customer panels, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. This crisis, as painful as it was, could be an opportunity for even greater change. When they presented their plan to George, including Michael's willingness to be involved, the relief on his face was palpable. "This is exactly the kind of proactive response we need," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You've turned a potential disaster into an opportunity for growth." As Sarah and Frank left George's office, energized by his approval and the path forward, they realized that this unexpected storm had not only tested their resolve, but had also opened up new possibilities for transformation. The viral review that had threatened to undo their progress was now becoming a catalyst for even deeper, more meaningful change. It was a powerful reminder that true growth often comes from facing challenges head-on, and that even the darkest clouds can have silver linings. In the wake of the viral review incident, the dealership found itself at a crossroads. The negative publicity had put them under a microscope, with every action and decision scrutinized by both the media and the public. But it also presented an unprecedented opportunity to demonstrate their commitment to change. Sarah and Frank, with George's full support, launched what they called the Bridges of Understanding initiative. At its core was a series of community dialogue sessions where people from all walks of life were invited to share their experiences with age discrimination and customer service. The first session was held on a crisp autumn evening in the dealership's newly redesigned showroom. The space, once a temple to luxury and exclusivity, had been transformed into a welcoming community hub. Comfortable chairs were arranged in a large circle, with Michael Chen seated prominently next to George. As people filed in, seniors, young professionals, community leaders, and curious onlookers, Sarah felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. This was a make-or-break moment for the dealership's new direction. George opened the session with a heartfelt speech. "We're here tonight not just to talk, but to listen," he began, his voice carrying a note of humility that immediately set the tone for the evening. "We've made mistakes, and we're here to learn from them. But more importantly, we're here to learn from you, our community." What followed was a powerful and sometimes emotional dialogue. People shared stories of feeling invisible as they aged, of being patronized or dismissed in various settings, not just car dealerships. Young people spoke of feeling judged for their age, and presumed lack of experience or financial stability. Michael Chen, who had been hesitant at first, found himself becoming a central voice in the conversation. "It's not just about selling cars," he said at one point, his voice quavering slightly with emotion. "It's about recognizing the dignity in every person who walks through your doors." Frank, listening intently, felt a lump form in his throat. He thought back to his treatment of George on that fateful day, realizing anew the impact of his actions. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up, his usual confidence replaced by a raw vulnerability. "I was part of the problem," he admitted, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "I judged people based on their appearance, their age. I thought I was being smart, efficient, but I was just being cruel." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I'm here to say I'm sorry, and I'm committed to doing better, to being better." Sarah watched as Frank's words seemed to ripple through the audience. She saw nods of appreciation, a few tears, and most importantly, a softening of the initially skeptical expressions. As the session wound down, people lingered, forming small groups to continue discussions. Sarah overheard snippets of conversation, people sharing contact information, making plans to meet again, discussing ideas for further community engagement. George approached her, a warm smile on his face. "You and Frank have done something remarkable here," he said, gesturing to the buzzing room. "You've turned a crisis into a catalyst for real connection." Sarah felt a surge of pride, but also a sense of the responsibility that came with it. "It's just the beginning," she replied. "We have so much more to learn, so much more to do." Over the next few weeks, the Bridges of Understanding sessions continued, each one drawing a larger and more diverse crowd. The dealership became known not just as a place to buy cars, but as a center for community dialogue and social change. The impact extended beyond the sessions themselves. Sarah and Frank worked to implement the insights gained, making subtle but significant changes to the dealership's operations. As the months passed, the transformation at the dealership continued to evolve and deepen. The Bridges of Understanding initiative had not only repaired the damage done by the viral review incident, but had catapulted the dealership into a position of community leadership that no one could have anticipated. Sarah and Frank, once unlikely allies, had become a formidable team. Their complementary strengths, Sarah's empathy and intuition, Frank's drive and newfound humility, created a synergy that inspired both staff and customers alike. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled outside the showroom windows, George called a staff meeting. The atmosphere was relaxed, a far cry from the tension-filled gatherings of the past. "I want to share something with all of you," George began, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of pride and emotion. "Yesterday, I received a letter from a customer. Not just any customer, but someone who visited us nearly a year ago." He unfolded a piece of paper, his hands trembling slightly. "This customer wrote, 'A year ago, I walked into your dealership feeling invisible and walked out feeling worthless. Yesterday I returned, unsure of what to expect. What I found was not just a place to buy a car, but a community that values every individual who walks through its doors. The kindness, respect, and genuine interest shown to me brought tears to my eyes. You haven't just changed a business, you've changed lives." George looked up, his gaze sweeping across the room. "This, right here, is why we do what we do. It's not about sales figures or profit margins. It's about the impact we have on each person we encounter." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat as she looked around at her colleagues. She saw misty eyes and gentle smiles, a shared understanding of the profound change they had all been part of. Frank, standing beside her, squeezed her shoulder gently. "Who would have thought," he whispered, "that learning to be kind could be so revolutionary?" As the meeting dispersed, Sarah lingered behind, watching as her colleagues chatted animatedly, the bonds between them stronger than ever. She realized that the transformation hadn't just been about changing how they treated customers, it had changed how they treated each other, how they viewed themselves and their role in the world. The dealership had become more than a workplace. It had become a beacon of kindness in the community, a living example of the power of compassion and respect. And in doing so, it had not only transformed its business, but had touched countless lives in ways that extended far beyond the sale of a car. On a bright spring morning, exactly 1 year after George's incognito visit that had set everything in motion, the dealership was buzzing with excitement. The staff had planned a surprise celebration for George, a token of appreciation for the journey he had led them on. As George walked through the doors, he was greeted by a sea of smiling faces. The showroom had been decorated with banners and balloons, and at the center stood a cake with the words, "Thank you for teaching us the power of kindness," written in elegant script. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes shining with emotion. "Mr. Hartley," she began, her voice carrying across the hushed room, "a year ago you walked through these doors and showed us that appearances can be deceiving. But more importantly, you taught us that kindness is not just a nice-to-have. It's the very foundation of who we are and how we do business." Frank joined her, his transformation from arrogant salesman to compassionate leader evident in his bearing. "You gave us a second chance," he added, his voice thick with gratitude. "You showed us that it's never too late to change, to become better versions of ourselves." George, visibly moved, looked around at the faces of his staff. No, his family. "I came here a year ago hoping to teach a lesson," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "But the truth is you've all taught me so much more. You've shown me the incredible power of kindness to transform not just a business but a community." He paused, collecting himself. "What we've created here goes beyond selling cars. We've created a culture of respect, empathy, and genuine human connection. And that, my friends, is the most valuable thing we could ever hope to achieve." As the celebration continued, with stories shared and memories recounted, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey they had all taken. The challenges they had faced, the obstacles they had overcome, had all led to this moment, a moment where kindness and compassion were not just buzzwords, but the very heart of who they were. She thought about the countless lives they had touched, the elderly couple who had found not just a car but a community, the young family who had been treated with respect regardless of their budget, the veterans who had found understanding and support. As the day wound down and the last of the cake was being shared, George pulled Sarah and Frank aside. "You two," he said, his eyes twinkling, "have been the driving force behind so much of what we've accomplished. I want you to know how proud I am of you both." Sarah and Frank exchanged a glance, both remembering how far they had come, from adversaries to allies, from employees to leaders. "We couldn't have done it without your guidance," Sarah said softly. Frank nodded in agreement. "You showed us the way, Mr. Hartley. You gave us the chance to be better." George smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "Perhaps," he said, "but you were the ones who chose to take that chance, to embrace change, to lead with kindness. And in doing so, you've created something truly remarkable." As they stood there, the warm glow of the setting sun filtering through the showroom windows, Sarah realized that their journey was far from over. The lessons they had learned, the changes they had made, were not an endpoint, but a beginning. They had discovered that kindness was not just a way of doing business, it was a way of life, a way of seeing the world and the people in it, a way of creating connections, bridging divides and touching lives in ways both big and small. And as they looked out at the community they had built, the lives they had touched, they knew that this was just the start. The ripples of their kindness would continue to spread, touching lives far beyond the walls of their dealership, creating a legacy of compassion that would endure for years to come. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of friendship and the glow of shared purpose, they understood that they had not just changed a business, they had changed the world, one act of kindness at a time. You may also like one of the two videos on the screen. Feel free to watch them now or subscribe to the channel to watch them later. Thanks for watching.